About history of the inflation in the US, and I've used this article to get a lot of ideas. And let's start with key terms. So inflation is a rise in general level of prices. Okay, so when I say general, that means it includes a lot of things, right? There are two ways to measure inflation. We have CPI and um, GDP deflator. Those two are price index. It shows how price changes over time. CPI mainly looks at consumer products, and a GDP deflator looks at all goods and services produced in the economy. And therefore, GDP deflator, for example, doesn't include a price of imports, even when import price surges and household are suffering. That's not going to be reflected in the inflation rate derived from GDP deflator. But when it comes to CPI, it doesn't only look at goods and services produced in that economy. Actually, indeed, it excludes goods and services produced in the economy and that is exported outside that country, because that is not consumed by the consumers within that country. For example, if it's CPI of the U.S., you know, people in the U.S. don't buy export products produced by U.S. people. So CPI is, we often use CPI to actually look at how how price change is affecting average household, average Americans. So that is inflation, and we have very important concept, which is aggregate demand. It's demand for all final goods and services produced in that economy. And we have aggregate supply, which is total supply of all goods and services in the economy. Um, and we have supply shock. Okay, it's a change in productive capacity of an economy. It can be both positive and negative. Positive means um, productive capacity of the economy is expanding, and adverse supply shock means productive capacity of an economy is shrinking. So even if they use all these available resources in the economy, they can only produce so much after that the adverse shock, and vice versa for positive shock. They they're using the they're fully utilizing all the resources available, and the output that they can produce, GDP that they can produce, is bigger than before. That is positive supply shock, and we're gonna look at this in detail. Okay, so we also have inflation chart here. I'm gonna go to the specific website that I got this data from later, but this shows inflation rate. Okay, just know that if inflation is around 2%, uh, that is normal. Okay, and that is inflation target for the government or uh, Fed. They want to make sure inflation is around 2%. If it's like 3%, 4%, it's a bit high. If it goes to like 7%, 6%, or 10%, that means prices rising very fast, which is quite problematic. Um, okay, and let's start with why inflation happen in general. The answer is that inflation is caused by shortage. Okay, shortage. What is shortage? Shortage is excessive demand over the supply. Excessive quantity demanded over quantity supply. So if quantity demanded is bigger, larger, or exceeds quantity supply, that means uh, shortage is happening. So when aggregate demand increases or aggregate supply decreases, there will be shortage, right? By definition, if aggregate demand increases and quantity supplied is in that case, quantity demand increases while quantity supplied hasn't changed. That is shortage. Uh, Same for this one. If quantity supply decreases while quantity demanded is same, that would also be a shortage. Okay, it can happen either by this, or both of these things. Phenomena can happen, but that's shortage. And why shortage? Why does shortage lead to inflation? It's because market drives up the price to cool down quantity demanded, right? So quantity demand is higher than quantity supplied. So the way to solve this is they raise price. The market raise the price. So this equilibrium, the condition of disequilibrium will be solved. And we all know this. We all know this from I think microeconomics, uh, right? If I just draw a typical market diagram, we have supply curve here and we have demand curve here, and we have price here and quantity output. So if and the price equilibrium price originally is here, so price 1. However, supply decreases because something happened that uh, made it more expensive for the firms to produce, and in that way this will be the new quantity supplied, and this would be new quantity demanded. So this is shortage. And how do they solve shortage? The market drives up the price so they can get back to the equilibrium where quantity supplied and quantity demanded equals to each other. So this can happen in a macro scale, uh, and that is what inflation is. Okay, yes. Okay, and when there are a lot of idle resources and labor, shortage can be easily solved by expanding production without raising prices. Okay, so what this is saying is that high inflation only happens as a result of shortage when economy is already fully utilizing its resources, okay, available. If they're not, meaning economy is in recession, there are so many idle resources, right? Factories that is available but not running, a lot of land available but not um, producing anything, or a lot of laborers available but not working at all, meaning they're unemployed. In that case, the shortage would lead to expansion of the output, GDP growth. They just increase the production. That would be the result. However, that won't be the result when economy is fully utilizing resources available. Let me draw this using ADS model. So this is macroeconomics diagram. We have aggregate supply, okay? Supply of all goods and services in the economy, and we have aggregate demand. And we have real GDP, which is output, okay? Um, Total output produced by that economy, in this case it's United States. We have price level. So if AD shifts to the right, people buy more stuffs. Without price going up, that would cause shortage, right? This is quantity demanded, quantity supplied, that's shortage. So the market drives up the price, and that will be the inflation. Price goes from P1 to P2. That is inflation, right? Because the shortage is solved by driving up the price. However, let's say that economy is at recession. They have a lot of idle resources that is left unused. That would look like okay, and that would look like this. Okay, so they're far below the full employment level of output, which would be somewhere around here. Okay, it's far below that. A lot of factories are closed. They're available, but they're just not operating. They're just because people don't buy stuff. Okay, this will be AD. In this case, even if AD shifts to the right, AD increases, people buy more stuff, people start buying more stuff. It can be government, it can be households, it can be firms, or it can be foreign people who import from the US. Okay, they buy more stuff. Yes, that will cause shortage, right? With the current price level, the original price level, this will be the new quantity demanded, and this will be quantity supply. Yes, there is shortage here. Shortage. But how is it going to be solved? Is it going to be solved by driving up the price? Not really. Price would rise a bit, but not really. Inflation is not going to be that high. However, the production has shifted from Y1 to Y2. Okay, so that will be a more like a output adjustment, right? Shortage is solved by firms producing more goods and services. They just expand their production. Why is it possible? Because there's so many resources that is idle for them, right? They just need to start using them. So easy. But if economy is pretty already operating at full employment level of output, that won't be easy. Okay, there aren't that many resources available that is left for them to use. So price will be driven up as a result. So that's the key thing that we all need to know. Okay, inflation tend to get very high as a result of shortage when economy is operating at full employment level of output. Okay, we need to know what does inflation do. Okay, what inflation actually does to people. So what we really need to know is that inflation redistributes wealth, and what it's not is that it doesn't make the entire economy poorer. Okay, if you imagine like price of all goods and services going up over time in the US, you might feel like US people are getting poorer and poorer. That is not entirely true. It doesn't make the entire economy poorer because someone will see their revenue rising, right? People have to receive the price. Okay, there are always someone who receive that price. If it's usually firms, right? If price is surging, consumers are paying more than before, which means firms are receiving more revenues than before. So in that way, the redistribution happens. So people could get poor. That is true. A lot of people can get poor as a result of inflation, but some other people will get richer. Right? That's the reality. It hurts savers. Okay, it hurts people like savers, lenders, and those who receive fixed income and compensation. Uh, in terms of savers, right? Imagine you're saving a certain amount of money, and you realize that price is surging. That means the saving that you have has less purchasing power. So in that case, it does make them poorer. Imagine people who receive fixed amount of income all the time. In that case, the inflation will be like, let's say if inflation is 5%, but the income stays the same, meaning the growth of income is 0%. Uh, the purchasing power of the income that they receive gets weaker and weaker. Right? They can buy less stuff with that fixed money. So that is tragic for those people. So and it benefits borrowers and payers of fixed wages. And who's borrowers in the economy? Is it you? It's often firms. Okay, firms borrow a lot of money and make an investment and operate their business and make money. And they have to pay the fixed amount of money, right? The principals plus the interest payment to the banks or whoever they're borrowing from. But they're gonna see their revenue rising as a result of inflation. It will be easier and easier to pay back the debt, and those who receive the debt, on the other hand, realize that although they successfully get back the amount of money that they were promised with, that is not going to be able to buy as much as they used to. So that's what happens. Okay, so that's the redistribution. And okay, let's actually start looking at the history of U.S. inflation. This is fun part. Let's look at this chart. So we have some time that shows very, very, very high inflation. For example, the highest was like 1918, which is 20%. I think this chart shows the inflation from December of the previous month to December of that month. Okay, so if inflation of 1918 means how much CPI, the price index, has changed in terms of percentage from December of 1917 to December of 1919. Okay, we see some 18% inflation here. This part is very high too. We see some surge in inflation here too. And then we, of course, have inflation of 2021 to 2022 here. So let's look at each of them. Okay, so the first one was World War One. Okay, the first one that I'm going to talk about is World War One, the war that mainly happened in Europe. The U.S. Eventually got involved in it, and the inflation at that time was exceeding 20%. Okay, at its peak, 20%. The price, I think it's CPI, or yeah, going up by 20% at its peak, which is extremely high. And why did that happen? It happened because of enormous shortage caused by the government demand for resources for wartime production. U.S. obviously, after joining the war, wanted to win the war, so the government bought a lot of weapons, used a lot of resources available to uh, make weapons, make food for soldiers, and those things, right? And that caused enormous shortages, and we all know that shortage will often result in inflation. We had World War II, where inflation exceeded 9% at its peak. Okay, so and that happened for the same reason. Shortage was again caused by the government demand and scarce resources. Okay, but we can actually realize that inflation during World War II is not as high as World War One, although both of the wars were total wars, meaning that government was spending huge amount of money and using huge amount of resources to make military weapons, military goods, and things like that. But there is a significant difference here. We see very high inflation here, but not as much here. Okay, and then at the same time, it fell in 1943. Did World War II ended? Did World War II end in 1943 or 1942? No, it continued until 1945. But inflation uh, um, dropped all the way to 2.96%, 2.3, 2.25, which is very low considering that the U.S. economy was wartime economy. And that happened because the government imposed rationing, okay, and price control. This inflation fell from 1943, right? And that such government intervention prevented shortage from leading to price surge. So there was shortage, okay? People uh, had money and were willing and able to buy a lot of consumer goods, but they were not allowed to because of rationing. So there was shortage, but that didn't lead to the price surge because of the price control, and also rationing kind of like forced households to only buy a certain amount of goods, right? And they can't buy like cars or refrigerators or a lot of luxury stuffs at this time. They couldn't travel, things like that. So that was the reality. So inflation was low throughout World War II, except the first, I think, 2 years. Well, like after U.S. Joined the war after being attacked by Japan. So let me actually draw this, okay? So those two examples kind of shows how wartime economy can often lead to inflation because government use scarce resources available in the economy. So we have aggregate supply and we have aggregate demand. And during World War One or World War Two, the beginning of uh, Pacific War, 80 shifted to the right because government were actively using resources uh, to make wartime goods. They were spending so much money, and the government spending increase did result in uh, significant shortage. Okay, this is the shortage, and then that drove up the price. So that's what happened in World War One, and something similar happened in World War Two, in the beginning of World War Two. Okay, let's look at post-war demand exceeding 18%. So that is another inflation that happened. Let's look at the chart, the graph. Oops, here. Okay, so yes, inflation was low until World War II ended, and then after that, 1946, 1 year after the end of World War II, the inflation went to 18.13%, very very high. Then the next year, the inflation was still high at 8.84%, very very high. Why did it happen? What caused the shortage this time? So it was related to World War II. As wartime restriction was removed, right? Rationing, price control, all these things were removed. People were allowed to buy what they want to buy as long as they have money. So demand for consumer goods surged when supply side was yet to transition from military goods production to consumer goods, leading to significant shortage. People wanting to buy. Well, they always wanted to buy throughout the war. Um, but after those restrictions were removed, they were ready to buy cars or refrigerators or a lot of household stuffs, or maybe some of them wanted to travel. All these people, because the war ended, they wanted to buy a lot of goods that actually make them happy, satisfy their needs. That is, which is consumer goods, right? But when we look at supply side, they were not ready for it. They have been producing a lot of wartime goods, military goods, but they weren't. Those factories weren't necessarily. Uh, uh, they needed some time to get ready to make those consumer goods. So that created a huge shortage, and shortage resulted in a spike in inflation, extremely high, very painful, and people's saving kind of lost its value. Um, yeah, so that's what happened. And we also have Korean War, where inflation exceeded 6%, which is not as bad as this or wartime economy inflation, but it is still high. Okay, let's look at the graph. So inflation did slow down. So the post-war inflation did slow down, and then it actually got to deflation, which is price general price level falling, and then it went up to almost 6% and 1950 and 1951, and it fell again. And what caused that? Okay, what caused the inflation to spike? It was Korean War. Okay, Korean War. And remember, U.S. did fight in Korean War. U.S. helped South Korea, um, and fought against North Korea, which was supported by the communists. And with fresh memories of total war for U.S. people, U.S. households, consumers scrambled to buy household goods, cars, and non-perishable food, clothing shortages. Okay, so people got worried. Like, okay, we're gonna experience another wartime restrictions. We have to buy whatever we want to buy right now, so we're not gonna be uh, suffering throughout the war, right? A lot of households thought, a lot of consumers thought that. So that's why a lot of those people bought a lot of goods and services. Well, a lot of goods actually, and non-perishable food is a very good example of that. Non-perishable means like they can last for a long time, right? So they can buy a bunch of them and store it and keep enjoying those food throughout the war because they do remember during World War II they were suffering from very little food available because a lot of resources were just prioritized for wartime productions. There was strict rationing and strict rationing kind of prevented all these households from eating, what they want to eat, or they weren't probably getting sufficient food. So a lot of those people ran to shops and bought those things, and that obviously create a huge shortage, driving up the price. So food price inflation was notably high, exceeding 10%. So okay, let's actually draw these two. Uh, Going back to ADAS model, which we all love because it's very good at explaining many different phenomena. So we have real output, GDP, inflation. Sorry, I think it's better to say price level. And we have AS and AD. Okay, so I think what happened right after World War II is that AD surged. New AD, when AS was quite limited in terms of providing goods and services that consumers want, household want, right? They were quite good at making wartime goods, military goods, because that's what they have been doing for around 5 years, 4 years. But they weren't necessarily ready for consumer goods production. So uh, you could argue that AS actually shifted to the left at the same time. Not because, well, you could argue that productive capacity of the U.S. in terms of, well, not really. I think productive capacity. It's a bit weird to say that productive capacity of the U.S. economy shrinked uh, after World War II. So let's just say, yeah, inflation happens like this, and same thing for Korean War. Okay, nothing changed in terms of aggregate supply, right? Productive capacity didn't shrink or expand as a result of the beginning of Korean War, but AD did surge because people are like, we have to buy all these goods and services that we're not services, goods that we're not going to be able to buy throughout the war Now we have to buy them. Now we have to store them. Now that created a huge shortage in the economy, driving up the price. So it's the same thing. Basically, varies. Yeah, I think in terms of why it happened, both of them were caused by surge in aggregate demand. And let's move on to 1970s oil shock. Okay, let's go back to the graph and look at what happened throughout 1970s. We have a huge spike in inflation here and here too. Okay, so throughout, and even when it's not as high as its peak, it's still almost 5%, which is very high. So inflation was very high throughout 1970s, and I'm gonna explain why that happened, and it happened for different reasons from previous examples. So the first wave was because of Yom Kippur War that happened in Middle East. I think it was a conflict between uh, Israel, Egypt, and um, Syria. I think some other countries in Middle East, and OPEC, which is it's a collection of multiple countries, oil producing countries. They did impose oil embargo against U.S. and some other Western countries, which led to significant shortage. Okay, you can easily imagine that when um, oil is not available, right? When oil price is driven up, the shortage will be following that, right? Because a lot of like manufacturing or production process needs oil, or they may need electricity, which is provided by the oil. And when those things get more expensive, firms will face the limits. They can't produce as much as they used to, right? Things get more expensive, and that's what shrink the productive capacity of the economy. So, and same thing, very similar thing happened in second wave, which was Iranian Revolution and Iran Iraq War, uh, which also disrupted the oil exporting from those regions, and inflation reached 14.8% at its peak, very high. And let's draw this again, and it's gonna look a bit different from what we have done. Okay. Okay, so we have output GDP, real GDP, and price level, and we have AS and AD. The economy was operating around full employment level, and then AS shrank like this. It shifted inward because productive capacity, which is here maximum level of output, has shrinked. Right, they're not gonna. The U.S. was not able to produce as much as they used to because they just had um, less oil than before, and with less oil, a lot of production is going to be limited, which created a huge shortage in the economy. It was a supply side shortage, okay, not necessarily driven up by demand. It was driven up by uh, the huge decrease, okay, huge fall in quantity supplied by the economy, and shortage was solved by inflation, okay, and that the macroeconomy of the U.S. reached new equilibrium from here, which was inflation, through inflation. Okay, so price one and price two, and that happened in throughout 1970s. Remember, there are two big waves. The first one, which was Yom Kippur War, and the second one which was Iranian Revolution and the war, the conflict. Yeah, very big conflict between Iran and Iraq. Very catastrophic war, and in the region, but it had catastrophic effect on the U.S. economy too. And I should also note that inflationary expectation remained high throughout 1970s too. Okay, so inflationary pressure is inflationary expectation. Okay, inflationary expectation was high throughout 1970s. It's like people expect if people expect inflation to be, for example, 6%, they will all these suppliers uh, will ask for, well, they try to raise the price that they receive by 6%, at least 6%, so they can keep up with the inflation. Imagine workers, right? Workers or suppliers for the firms. Workers expect that inflation would be 6% next year. Uh, Rational thing that they would do is to ask firms to raise their wages by 6%, right? Around 6%, so they're not gonna suffer too much uh, from the rising price that they're expecting. And same for firms. If firms think that the general price level would increase by 6% or 7%, they're gonna increase their price by 6% or 7% too, because otherwise, um, they're gonna see uh, what they need to pay, such as machines or ingredients, intermediate goods and things. Those prices could surge, while the price that they're charging is still low. That is horrible. That's gonna erode the profits. So firms also raise their price when they expect the inflation uh, uh, to continue to be high, and that's what kind of happened in 1970, right? Uh, Inflation uh, peaked around 12% at one point in the first wave, and a lot of firms and workers and all these people uh, expect inflation to be maybe not continue to be 12%, but still, a lot of people thought that it would still be high, so they in the process of negotiation or charging of price, deciding the price for next year, next month, they charged way higher than before, which actually do realize the high price. So I'm gonna talk about inflationary expectation more in detail later, but that's another reason why inflation did stay high throughout this period. Uh, and we have Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 19 around I think it's in 1990, or it can be 1 year before, which resulted in inflation exceeding 6%. Not as high as what they experienced in another conflicts in Middle East, which is those examples, but it was still high. Okay, and Iraq invaded oil-producing neighbor Kuwait. Iraq itself is producing oil. They had some conflict regarding, I think, uh, I'm pretty sure it was something about oil export. They couldn't really agree on, like, I think Iraq was arguing that Kuwait was producing too much oil, which kept the oil price too low, so they didn't like it, and they started. Well, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and even before the invasion actually happened, the tension before that was already driving up oil price uh, for the world, and the U.S. was importing oil from those regions. They saw their oil price surging too, and that made shortage in the U.S. economy for all these firms that is producing using electricity, using gas, using oil. They suffer from shortage. So same thing happened. I'm not gonna draw this again. It's exactly same thing. And the last one that I'm going to talk about is post-pandemic inflation, which reached 9.1% at its peak. Very, very high, and it was very painful inflation that people still remember, I believe. Um, okay, why did this happen? We all know that shortage caused inflation. Then we have to think about what caused that shortage, okay? So pandemic restriction was losing, okay? Well, I think it was in COVID pandemic uh, happened in 2020, but in 2021, a lot of countries, including the U.S., was removing all these restrictions, lockdowns. Uh, you know, uh, then what happened as a result of that is people started shopping, okay, leading to surging consumer demand. Now they were allowed to go out and buy stuffs, okay, maybe travel, buy consumer goods that always wanted to buy, travel around the countries, buy a lot of things, go to restaurant with your friends. All these things were possible, and for about a year, people were had to refrain themselves from doing that. People were, you know, but finally they were able to go out and do all these things. So aggregate demand definitely surged. Okay, and then what also happened on supply side is the supply chain remained disrupted from pandemic era. Okay, so pandemic era disrupted supply chain. I think everyone can agree with that. In a global scale, not only in the U.S. A lot of people, for example, died, or a lot of factories kind of shut down and stopped operations. And I think U.S. people, when U.S. people started ended lockdowns or stay home policy and started buying a lot of things, maybe some factories in the world were still shut down because COVID impact was still large. Still, a lot of people were not vaccinated in some countries. Something like all these things cause uh, supply chain, global supply chain to remain disrupted. Okay, but the aggregate demand in the U.S. economy is surging, and that's a perfect formula for inflation to surge. And let me draw that, and this would look a bit more unique from uh, the previous ones. So we have this GDP, price level, and we have aggregate supply curve. Okay, and we have aggregate demand. And during recession, aggregate demand was very low because people were not able to buy stuffs. It's different from rationing during World War II, although it had some similarities, right? Well, during pandemic, it's not like people were not allowed to buy stuffs, but people just had to stay home. So physically, they were. Oh, it's kind of hard to buy as many stuffs as before when you're like staying home and not going out, right? So AD was very low. And AS also shifted to the left throughout pandemic, uh, for the reason that I explained already. And then AD surged. Okay, so this is new AD. Let's say this is 1 and this is 2, and that caused a significant shortage. So this will be quantity supply and quantity uh, demanded after uh, COVID restriction was removed, and that created a huge shortage. And how is shortage solved? By driving up the price. So that's what market did, and the market did cause inflation. So inflation surged from here to here, and that was the inflation that happened. 9.1%, very painful. People saving lost the significant portion of its value. They just can't buy as many stuffs as before. But inflation did slow down after 2022. But okay, that's it for this video. You just need to know that inflation happens as a result of shortage, and shortage can happen uh, due to two different reasons. They can happen at the same time, or one of them can happen. It's either uh, uh, increase in aggregate demand, surge in aggregate demand, or decrease in aggregate supply, which is productive capacity of the economy. Thank you.